Bom dia a todos. Obrigado a todos que estão aqui conosco, presentes aqui no auditório Alfredo Bose, no Instituto de Estudos Avançados da USP. Obrigado a todos que estão nos assistindo pela internet. Meu nome é Antônio Mauro Saraiva, eu vou mediar esse nosso evento. Nós temos a honra de receber aqui, na sua primeiro evento público, o professor Donald Peterson, que está como professor visitante do Instituto de Estudos Avançados, vai ficar conosco por um tempo ainda. E esse é o primeiro dos seminários que ele nos dá. O professor Donald Peterson, ele é escocês de nascimento, de Dumfries, e sua educação, ele tem um Masters of Arts da University of Edinburgh, PhD pelo University College em London, e um outro Master in Science pelo Imperial College em London. E ele trabalhou nos últimos anos, evidentemente, além do Reino Unido, na Alemanha, na China e agora aqui no Brasil. Ele atuou em alguns centros de pesquisa, como o European Computer Industry Research Center, ECRC, em Munique. Também trabalhou no London Knowledge Lab, LKL, em London, da London University. E agora está conosco aqui no Instituto de Estudos Avançados. Suas áreas de atuação, de interesse, são lógica, filosofia, psicologia e computer science. O tema desse seminário de hoje é também o tema de trabalho do professor Peterson ao longo desse tempo que vai ficar conosco, que é Life in the Cognitive Era. Um tema bastante interessante que assume diversas facetas e possibilidades de estudo, né? Vou pegar um pouquinho do que está dito aqui no prospecto, né? Que a relação entre humanos e máquinas na era da tecnologia cognitiva, ou seja, era da conectividade, da inteligência artificial, dos robôs, e o desafio de fazer com que ela traga mais benefícios do que prejuízos a áreas como educação, trabalho, negócios e saúde. Certamente todos nós já experimentamos os dois lados dessa moeda, ou dessas moedas, os benefícios e os possíveis potenciais prejuízos, né? E aí ele aborda a necessidade de um significativo processo de requalificação e redefinição dos papéis desempenhados nessas e em outras áreas. Enfim, eu vou parar por aqui, porque o resto ele depois vai abordar, né? Mas é um tema bastante instigante. Temos a previsão de uma série de seminários abordando cada um desses ou outros tópicos, né? Tem aqui uma handbook que ele preparou, que vai estar depois disponível. Eu queria lembrar aos colegas que estão nos assistindo pela internet que é possível enviar perguntas através do e-mail IEA-responde@usp.br, tudo junto, IEA-responde@usp.br. Na medida do possível, depois a gente vai coletá-las e passar para o professor Peterson. O professor Peterson entende alguma coisa de português, já teve algumas vezes aqui no Brasil, né, em outros eventos, e é uma honra para nós tê-lo aqui. Então, ele vai fazer uma apresentação. Como ele disse, a audiência está livre para fazer perguntas, se quiser interromper, mas não havendo, depois, no final, nós teremos um espaço para debate. Bem? Don, it's a pleasure having you here. You probably understood most of what I said here. So, we're happy to have you here, and the floor is yours. Thank you.
Bom dia. Muito obrigado por virem. Eu sou muito feliz de ser aqui com vocês para discutir os problemas da vida em era cognitiva. But I think that brings my Portuguese to an end. So I will try to speak slowly in English. I'm sure your English is better than my Portuguese so far. Let me first do admin for this seminar. I've tried to make everything easy for everybody. So this is how we do it. That is the seminar handbook, and I think you all have it, or your friends have it. It's been passed around. So if you put it up electronically, and you go to the website, link here, you get the seminar and workshop file store index. So my method will be to put relevant materials in this file store. So you can see it a bit. There are the materials for today. As the seminar progresses, I will simply add to it. And if we have associated workshops, they'll all go in the same place. So that should make it easy for you. I've done another thing, which is I put my PowerPoint slides in the file store, so you can have them. I really don't mind if people use them in their own work. I only ask that you attribute them to the author, which is me in this case. So let me show you, for example, here are some slides on cognitive computing. Now, we will use some of these today if we have time, but it's just to show you the method of the links. Here, for example, is one of the links. So all you need to do is press that, and eventually you get background literature. So that means you don't need books and you don't need libraries, but I do hope, in fact, that it's an interesting enough topic for you to do that, and for that reason, there's a long bibliography at the end of this document. So you've got it all, but the way to approach the seminar, if I may suggest, is 1, 2, 3. This is number 1. Number 2 is you may wish to follow up the links, and number 3, you may want to buy books. And if you buy any book on this subject, the one by Schwab, S-C-H-W-A-B, from 2016, and he has 1 or 2 more in quick succession, 2018 as well. See what you think of it. He certainly is talking about the cognitive era. So before I begin, let me just say that I'm not worried about the word cognitive. I'm just going with the fashion. That's what people call it. They don't all belong to IBM, although IBM uses it. And so I brought my only prop. What's this in Portuguese? Cabide. Okay, so the word cognitive, I think, for everybody should be a coat hanger. We just hang stuff on it and try and do something interesting. But we could worry about exactly what the word cognitive means. I think it's like many words. It doesn't really mean exactly one thing. Just like the word cheese doesn't mean exactly one thing. So let me start the slideshow, unless anybody wants to say anything now. Eu falo mais rápido? It's okay, is it? Because I get excited, then I start. The premise of this delivery is that we have turned a corner. Life is not the same as it was some decades ago, and it will probably never be the same again. Now, there are corners and corners. Of course, we can say there is nothing new under the sun. We can say a lot of this stuff existed in research laboratories decades ago, in fact. But I think it's enough of a corner that we've turned that we really need to grasp it and think. And for example, I think there's a real danger that school education is already out of date. And this is not something about Brazil in particular. I think it's already out of date in the UK. In fact, the computing knowledge that we teach, we could have been teaching 20 years ago. So this is a real problem for the job prospects of the young people who are coming to us, and I think the list goes on. Okay, so to state the obvious, here is a list of some technologies. But I think most of you will be aware of these technologies. We can talk about any one of them if you like, but these are mostly things which did exist in research laboratories, but have only recently come onto the street, so to speak. Now that transition is not complete. For example, intelligent agents, which act like a butler and look after you and get to know you, and they know your preferences, and they remember everything. These have not hit the real world very well yet. We have many things that run on mobile devices, on mobile phones, but Microsoft, for example, have spent billions of dollars on intelligent agents, but what I hear is that they think they can make more money if they keep us waiting. But for example, in an educational context, I think we're looking forward to a time when rich people can buy an educational agent privately for their child, and only the child can use it, and it looks around day and night when the child is sleeping, finding references for the essays the child has to write and so on. Now, I'll be using the word ditropic in a moment, and what I mean by that is that one thing can have good effects or bad effects according to context and according to how we use it. And that the prospects of outlawing technologies are not very good. We need to learn with them, we need to use them ethically, and this is an example with the intelligent agents. They will not go away because they will be useful, particularly in a world which has become a chaos, a flood of information. And I'll be speaking about this later, but there are real problems attaching to the cognitive era. There are real advantages, but they exist not in the thing itself, not in the mobile phone in your hand, but in the way we use it. So, now for for simplicity's sake, I've put up this simple grid. Now, grids are a blessing and a curse. Of course, they oversimplify things, and of course, we can't live without them. So for purposes of today's presentation, I'm concerned with technologies of a type I call CAR. Now, that's connectivity, which is getting even faster with 5G. That's artificial intelligence, which is no longer a secret of the AI labs, and robotics. Now, connectivity has the potential to drown us in information and to fragment our attention. AI has the potential to do all sorts of good and bad things. And robotics, of course, however useful they may be, raise very big issues about employment. Yeah. because what we expect is a selective effect in which some sectors of the working population are made unemployed more than others. And I'll talk about that because we need to predict this and do something about it now. Now, the conditions I've identified, I call MBIFC. Now, what I mean is that our data is now massive, and this will not go away. The Internet of Things collects data for us, feeds it to computer systems like IBM's Watson, for example, and this makes big data analytics as much a necessity as a luxury. At one time, it was used to harvest data from supermarkets, who buys what on a Friday evening, and so on. And that was the small beginning of big data analytics, well, one of the small beginnings. But we now have so much data, for example, from the railway systems, the tunnels, the track, all the trains, that I don't think we can exist without it. Now, volatility is a word people use in business studies, and the general formula is that business and life have become volatile, meaning, and therefore we need to be agile. So it translates directly to demand on us. And it's interesting that it comes from business, because in business, if you don't get it right, you go bankrupt. Yeah? So there is a real, it's not exactly safety critical, but it's survival critical. And I think we need to take heed of what they say in business about this. Now, I use the word immediate because, in contrast to the past, you can have immediate communication with people on the other side of the world. Maybe not the moon, but the other side of the world, and it has just become easy. Now, I don't know if you like getting 50 emails per day. Don't hesitate to send me email. I will be very happy, but I think we would all agree it's a real nuisance. Yeah? And the software we have does not do a good job of organizing what comes in. Yeah? It does not do a good job of helping us, like a front desk, to interact with cyberspace. Cyberspace being William Gibson's word. You know William Gibson? Oh, he's a science fiction writer, and he wrote about some of these things a bit before they really happened, which is pretty good. Now, I say fragmented, and I mean this in several senses, but there is no way that the data that comes to us is all neatly organized so that we can relate one thing to another. Now, I'll be speaking about the human brain quite soon. I think we can identify stresses which life in the cognitive era creates, which our brain is not really designed for. But I think we need to approach these issues with knowledge of our cognitive functions, because we are not just a bucket that fills up with marbles. Not at all. Our brains work in particular ways, and therefore can be pressurized or over-pressurized or assisted in corresponding ways. I use the word cyborg simply to mean that as computers get more intelligent, we are working with them rather than using them as tools. Now, this does not mean that they are exactly the same as us. I think it's a bit boring to worry too much about that. A computer is not a human being. There is some overlap, though, and we are moving in the direction of synergy. So I gave the example already of the intelligent agent, which acts as a butler or like a personal assistant. Now, we are, in a sense, working with it. We can do things it can't do, but it can do things we can't do. It remembers our diary perfectly. It never disappears because it lives in the cloud, and wherever you go in the world, you can just call it up online. So in ways it's better than a human being, in ways not so good. But just to mention one of the emerging dimensions here, it's quite clear that in the future our intelligent agents will need to communicate with each other. And they will need to trust each other or sometimes not trust each other. So they will enter into what in China is called guanxi, which means your network of connections. And they will do each other favors, and sometimes they will refuse to help each other. And no doubt in this wicked world, they will give fake news to each other. Human beings will actually tell their agents to misinform these other ones. I think this is inevitable. Now, in my little charts in today's presentation, I'll appeal to 4 categories. So that's education, work, health, and well-being as life issues. But I'm very much interested to hear what you think about these. I've made up some little charts. They're not supposed to be definitive. They're not supposed to be the last word. Is my English okay for you? Oh, fantastic. Okay. Yeah. So anyway, let me just say a few things about LCE, Life in the Cognitive Era, as a study. Right? Now, according to me, anyway, it is naturally, inherently multidisciplinary. Yeah? Just as on a bicycle wheel, the hub is supported by several spokes. Now, I don't think multidisciplinarity is always a good thing. I do not think it always works. And I've had a lot of experience of it. I think sometimes it can work very well. But anyway, the topic of life in the cognitive era it impacts many disciplines. Yeah? To the point that a narrow treatment is actually quite legitimate. And the narrowness that I'll introduce here is to apply logic to it, as you'll see in a minute. It's both theoretical and practical. It's obviously theoretical, but in rather a strange way, because reality has moved faster than the dictionaries. And the dictionaries are not allowed to put new words in until they become conventional. I mean, that's their job. And so it's strangely difficult, for me anyway, to get the vocabulary to talk about these things. So you'll see I introduced 2 new words. Here, one of them is ditropic, because we do not have an English word for that, which says exactly what I want. Now, as well as being theoretical, it's very practical. I think we live already at a time when the content that children get at school is not necessarily very useful to them when they go into adult life. There was a time when some countries thought that teaching Latin was good for the brain. So it was some sort of general thinking skill. I don't know if that's true or not. It certainly didn't help me. But I think we have to be very careful. There are only so many hours in a day. There are only so many hours in a week. And if we teach the wrong things, you know, it may feel very noble. And I don't know exactly what you do in Brazil. But as you'll see, I think that there are curriculum topics which are fairly obvious. In fact, I hope everything I say today is obvious. Now, it's critical and it's technical. We definitely need the sort of critical distance of the arts and the humanities to evaluate, for example, whether this really is supporting the good, the good life, which I think in Portuguese you call bem-estar. Yeah? Now, if it's not doing that, we've really got a problem. But it's also technical. I think the time has passed when it's practicable for adults to lack any knowledge of computing. And I'm sorry to say that in my own country, the UK, the school teaching has descended into something which is called ICT, meaning information and communication technologies, and it's a disgrace. Yeah? And employers know this. You know, I mean, they're not crazy. Now, it's timely, so forgive me if I speak in a definite way about this, but I really think that it's a time when the academy can do something useful. And it's a time when universities can do something that's actually of its time and is useful. Now, by ditropic, I've already said what I mean by that. I intend in the future to use its cognates, which are monotropic and polytropic, from the Greek. I know we have expressions like ambivalent and every coin has two sides and so on, but this is just all a bit vague. The word ditropic simply means that all technologies, or maybe most technologies, have good potential and bad potential, and usually the potential to do both at the same time, good and bad. And I think parents nowadays are very aware of this when they see the effect of internet addiction and social media addiction on their children. And they have to make a decision whether to let the children use their handheld devices at the meal table, for example. And I needn't go on about this. This is common knowledge. At the same time, it's very positive for the children to have internet access. If you have to write an essay, you can quickly discover all sorts of things instead of spending hours waiting in the library, and so on and so forth. So all I can see is good and bad mixed up together. Okay, now, the next few slides might seem a little bit of a surprise, but they present a picture of the way our minds work. Now, that has implications for the cognitive era, because that's the mind which is processing all this data, etc., coming out of cyberspace. It is not going into a bucket, and we are not a bucket. So the angle I wish to emphasize is called situationism. Now, this, it comes from Piaget, for example, though I think he was a bit confused, if I may say so. But anyway, the idea is that in our head, we have two main things. One is schemas, and the other is awareness of context. And so a schema is like a recipe or a formula. It tells us how to do something in a standard way, which works most of the time. But when surprise, context, circumstances, situations come up, we have the ability to modulate exactly how we do things. And it's easy to give examples of this, simple concrete examples. Perhaps you follow a recipe for getting to work every day. You walk the same route every day. But one day, as you walk down the pavement, there is a huge puddle of black liquid. So what do? Obviously, you walk, you stop, you go around it, you continue. But that was not in your formula, it was not in your recipe. In fact, nobody ever talked about it. Or another case or analogy is air traffic control for airplanes. Of course, they have a flight plan, a formula, schema, whatever. It tells them how to fly from A to B. But in fact, air traffic control meddle and interfere quite rightly. If a volcano explodes in the flight path, then air traffic control gets on the radio and says, go up 2,000 feet, turn left, turn right, turn left. And so your plane survives. But this model of the way our minds work, I've explained in a very schematic way, ironically enough. But the point for the life in the cognitive era is not so much about our schemas, our formulae, our standard procedures. It's about context. Because where the business people talk about volatility, I would say in cognitive terms, we're talking about volatility of contexts. So I'll explain that a bit more later, but I hope you see even from this that we need to be structural in approaching these things. It's not just as if somebody took a bucket of water and put it over our head and we say, oh, we're too wet now. It's more structural than that. Now, I'll quickly refer to Aristotle and to brain science and to my own contribution to logic, which is epiduction, just in a minute. But I just pause for a minute. Does anybody want to say anything? No? Okay. Right. Well, Aristotle in the Nicomachean Ethics, Book 6, introduces the idea of phronesis. Now, what he means by that is practical wisdom, and he emphasizes that it requires experience to gain this. So a clever schoolboy may be very clever, but it may take some years before they get phronesis. It's the same in the army. Army training can work very well in producing young soldiers, but it's well known that it takes about 10 years experience in the field before they become a good soldier. But I'm not an expert in these. Anyway, we can speak as long as you like about Aristotle, but for present purposes, I simply note that what he says is relevant to the modern age, spanning 2,500 years. And I think what we need now is a sort of cyber phronesis, as I will try to explain. I think good judgment is not universal in use of these technologies. Well, now we look quickly at the executive function of the prefrontal cortex of the human brain, which is here. It's also elsewhere in the brain because in the brain everything is connected anyway. So we're just saying that the main center is the green bit, and it's called the prefrontal cortex. Now, there are a lot of models about how this works. There are a lot of models about what it does. It's not easy to find out what's going on in the brain. You cannot just look. It, in fact, does not light up in one place just because you're doing one thing. Although actually speech and grammar are quite localized here, for example. But broadly speaking, executive function is like air traffic control. The airplane is told when it can take off. In fact, air traffic control decides if it can take off. And once it takes off, air traffic control bosses it around and tells it to do this and that is not in the flight plan. And it's absolutely essential. And this is a really interesting thing. There's only one world in which we could live without air traffic control. And that's a world that has got only one airplane in it. Yeah, obviously. So I think in the early days in Australia, it was like that. You know, people bought the first airplanes and they really didn't have to worry about crashing into people. But anyway, this means, terminology apart, that the prefrontal cortex is a situation processor. Now, in the case of air traffic control, they give you the situation. They interfere. But in life in general, we don't always have air traffic control. But we have sensitivity to context. And it's so obvious that it's easy to forget it. I mean, speaking to you now, I try to speak slowly because it's a reasonable thing to do. If I'm speaking to a deaf person, I speak loudly because it helps them. If I don't want anybody to hear, I whisper just like this. Yeah? I whisper very quietly. We do this all the time. And it's all, the sentence might be, the cat is sitting on the mat. But we deliver it differently for different circumstances. Now, back to Aristotle, he would say that somebody who fails to do that does not have phronesis. Yeah? They're talking like a robot, people sometimes say. So that's the brain that we bring to cyberspace. And so the cognitive revolution is new, but our brain is not new. And that's why I refer to people from 2,500 years ago, because I think it's worth remembering that we have not invented a new brain for ourselves. And I'll refer later to the Greek Stoics, also to Heraclitus, who came before Socrates. The Stoics, of course, came after in a movement called Hellenistic philosophy. But I will suggest that, in fact, the insights of these thinkers so long ago have a certain purity, that there was no cyberspace, there was no cognitive revolution, but they were talking about our nature, which we bring to the new situation. So broadly, it's not enough to think about technology. We also need to think about the apparatus which we bring to the situation. Now, with this, I'll be quick. This is Epiduction, which I introduced in 2015 in your Brazilian journal, Manuscrito. I have two names for it, actually. I call it transduction as well, and I'm yet to discover which name people prefer. But the idea, surprise, surprise, is that we have a schema that tells us what to do. We then say, thank you very much, but I'm now going to see if I want to adjust exactly what we do, which we do in response to context. So you can just about read there, Z equals SDCR. That means Z is a situation, and it divides into a schema, a default or standard result, C for context, and R for a reset. And I think it would need to be another time that we go into this. But for example, Marvin Minsky has published on roughly this point, and it's a standard point in computing where you can do something called configuration at runtime. So it means that you don't alter the program you're running, but it allows you to reset some of its variables so it behaves differently. And that's a standard in Unix, it's a standard in computing in general. And so that's maybe for another day, but this is intended as a systematic approach to something which can get a bit vague, namely life in the cognitive era. And my claim is that it describes what the brain is doing there. The brain is an epiductive engine, and it also addresses what Aristotle was talking about. And one motive, by the way, is that there really is a vocabulary problem. I mean, I've been up and down and inside out of the English dictionaries. It's very hard to find the right words. And so this level of formality is intentional. Yes? It's not, I'm not trying to turn everyday life into algebra, but as a way of expressing these things. For example, formula number 10, or law number 10, it's not easy in ordinary language. And it's not the first time I've come across this. In the Middle Ages, the Arabic mathematicians did not have what we now call algebra. And algebra obviously is an Arabic word, but they didn't have it at one point. And so they wrote these incredibly complicated sentences, the size of a paragraph, desperately trying to express things that then became quite easy in algebra. So that's the spirit of this.
So about your abductive logic, just to get a general idea, so is that related with Marvin Minsky and others' semantic frames work in AI research? And also, is that related with representation of common sense knowledge somehow?
I think more the first one. I mean, Minsky wrote a paper called the Frames paper, which has the strange history that different versions exist and they exist in strange places. But what I call a schema, he calls a frame. And perhaps the first person to talk about this was Piaget. And so there is a bit of difference in terminology, but I really like Minsky's work, and yes, it is relevant. Yeah. And so I think to explain epiduction more fully, I would certainly be referring to that. And well, let me just say an essential idea which Minsky introduced was that of a default value. And this is quite obvious in computer science. We do it all the time. But it's not altogether obvious that you can have a slot which by default has a value, but the value can be overwritten at runtime. Yeah? So I think it's no accident that Minsky is a computer scientist, among other things. And yes, the influence of context, I would suggest, is to overwrite default values in slots in the frame. Okay. Yeah. So we have a quarter of an hour now. There is some choice in what we do. I have more slides than we have time, but we can talk about cognitive computing and big data, and there I take the IBM system as a reference. Now, this is not because I belong to IBM or anything like that. It's because they've done a lot of serious practical work with customers in industries, several industries, as I can explain. And this is typical of IBM. In fact, if you want to be skeptical, the ideas in the Watson system are perhaps not very original. Natural language processing, probabilistic reasoning, parallel hardware, they didn't exactly invent these things, and I don't think they pretend that they did. What they do is to put something together and then work with the industries to see what is working, what isn't working, and to see how it's being used. And they've had so much success with this that I prefer to take them as my reference. But let's see. I think we might do well to talk about the Watson system. Now that's a primer. I have about 100 slides for future treatment of it, if that's what you would like. But let me start with this. But what I've called the situation, I think is, quite surprising. If you were a person from the moon or from Mars and you came down to Earth, I think this is one of the things you might find surprising, that here is an industry that's roaring ahead. In London, it's quite astonishing. It involves data science. After all, it uses big data analytics. And if you want a job as a 22-year-old in London or in the UK, they're just about top of the class. I mean, there's a huge demand for people who are expert in this. But how much of this is taught in school? I think just about nothing. IBM, in fact, put out a lot of little videos, which you can find on YouTube. And they do quite a good job of explaining what they're doing and why. But I've already said I'm concerned about curriculum. It no doubt applies in universities as well. Cognitive computing from IBM has been roaring ahead, but the connections with universities are quite limited. In the UK, Imperial College, where I was at one time, have some sort of relationship with IBM Watson. And it's the University of Leicester, I think, also have one, and there's some sign of it in Edinburgh. But as for undergraduate curriculum courses on this sort of thing, there's really not much yet in my country. And there is a little bit on data science, both in the United States and in my country, so that's not completely ignored. But there does seem to be a gap. I've mentioned a gap between dictionaries and what's actually happening, which means that we don't have the words to think our thoughts and express our thoughts, which is a bit scary. And we have a gap in education, where certain things are obviously happening and could be taught, but there maybe we need to be sympathetic. I mean, school teachers can't suddenly know a new subject, and they might quite rightly be reluctant to talk about things they have not experienced, which we call parrot teaching. Anyway, what IBM did was to put together a system that has natural language processing in, I think, 6 languages at the front end. Then it uses big data analytics, and we all know what that is. It detects patterns in mass data, and it does so better than we can. This is an ability that we have some of, but the computer systems have more of. And then it feeds this into probabilistic reasoning, which works in a very interesting way through something called the candidate generation selection pipeline. And arguably, we do the same with our own brains. Basically, you generate a lot of hypotheses, possible answers to your question, and then you have to rank them according to which one is the most plausible. And that's called scoring and ranking. And all the time, the system can work with unstructured data, heterogeneous data, which we find difficult. Now, the industries where this has been applied already include agriculture and energy, running grid operations, oil and gas, that's discovery and maintenance, taking data from the Internet of underwater things or underground things. Renewable energy is a very interesting application area. So we see here that these new developments in computing are not simply all evil. I don't doubt they can be used for nefarious purposes, but if they can support grid operations for renewable energy sources, which of course are difficult to manage. If you have wind turbines and so on, it's not easy to predict when what they will be doing tomorrow and what the wind will be doing. It's being applied in banking and obviously in finance, because the prediction of financial patterns quickly is important in those industries, and we can be sure that they have systems they do not tell the public about. The same with the military. Obviously, sometimes things are kept quiet. But if you have a system or a way of using a system which can make profit for you financially, you might not want other people to know. It's used in hospitality, it's used in insurance, marketing certainly, predicting whether green shoes will be fashionable next year is going to earn your company a lot of money if you get it right. So it's used for predicting. It's being used in medicine, for example, in epidemiology, and it's being used for security. Dubai uses IBM Watson to tell its police what to do. So it's obviously quite scary territory. Sheikh Mohammed has announced that he wants Dubai to be a cognitive city. Yeah? Now, quite what that will result in, I don't know. But interestingly, as far as I could discover, there's no university out there that is teaching this stuff. So it's a relationship between the state and a big company. Yeah, I mean, that's the worry. That's the worry. But the policeman is connected, or policewoman, the police person is connected by radio to the control center, and the control center has ways of getting information that we don't know about. And obviously that nowadays can include video surveillance and facial recognition, recognition of your car number, and, well, the worry always is that effective technology in the hands of bad people produces bad results. And how can you be sure that all the people in the police force are good? So, you know, it's obvious. But anyway, they want to be a cognitive city. Now, I'm aware of time running out. I've put here what I call an LCE chart. Now, you might fill it out very differently, but the question overall is just, what does this mean for education, for work, for health, and for wellness? Now, I include wellness, it's not exactly the same as health, but I think in Portuguese you call it bem-estar. Because obviously some of the effects of the new technologies may diminish people's well-being without making them actually physically ill. So I think I'll stop in this slide set. There are more for another occasion. I would just like to show you some details of IBM Watson so that you can see what the words are referring to. Because I think we should keep this a little bit technical, but not very technical. So just one moment, please. There are some industries which are being addressed by IBM and others. They call it augmented intelligence. But let me now you see the links here. You can have these slides, and if you follow up the links, you'll get all sorts of background information. But let me go straight to this one. Now, this is basic to Watson's architecture, and you can see the generation of hypotheses, narrowing down using probabilistic reasoning, and running it all on parallel hardware. Now, parallel hardware is sometimes useful, sometimes not, but it requires that the task given to it should be parallelizable. Okay? Not all problems are parallelizable, and what they've done with the Watson system and this hypothesis generation selection pipeline is actually to make a very good use of parallel hardware, because the individual hypotheses can, guess what, be evaluated in parallel. Okay. But if we don't know this, we don't really know what Watson is doing. And there has been a certain amount of hype. It won a quiz show called Jeopardy, where it did better than human beings. Now, that in itself does not tell us very much. But this is, in fact, what it's doing. Yeah. And there's another diagram. But the slides are already on the little file store for you, so you can follow these up. Now, I'll just be a moment. So I think we have 2 more minutes until I stop talking. Right, so I'll just bring us full circle. This is a painting by Piet Mondrian, by the way. I'm not trying to say anything very complicated. It just somehow, to me, evokes the topic that we have. But we've noted that the world has changed through many technologies which actually the public are well aware of. These are not secrets. I've used this little grid for talking about these things. I call the technologies CAR, C-A-R. Maybe you have a better word, but it's not just connectivity, it's not just AI, it's not just robotics. I've referred to several conditions of life which are new, even if they're not completely new. And I've identified 4 basic sectors: education, work, health, and well-being. I've introduced the concept ditropic, and I've used the word epiduction. These are both not in the dictionary. And I've talked about our cognitive architecture. I've mentioned Aristotle on phronesis, the prefrontal cortex of the human brain, a form of logic which is designed to characterize situational thinking, which is what Aristotle wanted, and it's what the brain does. And we've come to one example, which is big data and cognitive computing. So I will stop now, and I'm going to play a little bit of music, because it shows that the concept ditropic was actually identified long ago in the song called Accentuate the Positive. So that's it. Thank you.
To accentuate the positive feeling, mind it to negative, latch on to the affirmative, don't mess with Mr. In Between.
So we have now time for you to ask questions. I don't know if I have any questions coming from the internet, but please feel free to ask any questions you want to done with the soundtrack.
To illustrate his last remark, Jonah in the whale, Noah in the ark. What did they do just when everything looked so dark?
Man, they said we better accentuate the positive, eliminate
I would like to ask you, you put the word epiduction, and then between parentheses, you put or transduction. Then this concept, transduction, it is utilized by, it is used by Simondon in his analysis of technology. He the idea of transduction, and so I am a little bit curious if there is a connection and.
Okay, I'm not aware of Simondon's work, so I can look into it. The transduction concept was actually introduced by me in 2015 regarding cross-cultural communication, not technology. So this is a different application. But is it Simondon? Yeah, okay. I can look into it, but it may be the same word. Of course, it's a word that's used in electronics as well.
He utilizes it as a form of inference or involved in invention, technical invention, and something like this. It's different from, for example, it's a material. It's an inference that has material repercussions. Inventions in machines or in communication and practical. Different from abduction, from purse. That maybe it's theoretical. The idea of an abduction. But it's okay. It's also about invention.
Okay.
So it's.
I'll have a look. I mean, all we've established is that two people have used the same word. Whether we actually are using it in the same way, I don't know yet. But I prefer the word epidduction nowadays. From the Greek. So it's one thing on top of another one. But let me have a look, and thank you for pointing it out.
Yep. So a follow-up question is still about epidduction. What are your application? What is your motivation in terms of both science and applications? So in terms of science, it seems that you are thinking of cognitive science research, and you are claiming that the brain works like that, right? And in terms of applications, you talked a lot about education, teaching, children, and so on. Are you thinking about using that for teaching, or any other application you have in mind?
Okay, so I've only mentioned one application today, which is the one in there. A motivation for me is that I think it's a phenomenon of reasoning, whatever we call it, which appears in developmental psychology in children age 4, so-called theory of mind. It's applicable to Vygotsky's psychology, to the psychology of cross-cultural communication. I think it's applicable to the ancient Greeks, for example, to Protagoras, and also to Aristotle, as a way of agreeing with some things they said, as a way of articulating what they said. And I think its relevance to life in the cognitive era is it's a way of articulating something we do anyway, and we have to do, and we're designed through evolution to do, which nowadays is encountering the deluge of data, etc., which the cognitive era brings. So those are some application areas. You mentioned school children. Frankly, I don't know. I don't know if it is applicable there. Yeah.
Yes, it's a question more or less in this line, but more specific. Because you start life with education. But from all I have seen, it's a very specific education for computing people. I mean, it is, of course, if you are doing a course of computing in the mathematics or engineering, that's clearly that's what they need. But I don't see almost any relation between this and education for life. I mean, education of people. Because the truth is that the environment is changing a lot, technology is changing a lot, but people remain the same. Change really in the way the mind works didn't happen yet. We are hoping that people start to think differently, but that's not what we see. So I agree. I have been before yesterday on Saturday in a very nice meeting from mathematics for normal people in a bar. And then they were discussing artificial intelligence and what is really possible to accomplish with artificial intelligence. And it is very, very, very little. Because the truth is that we don't know how the human mind works. I have made this specific question for the person that knows more artificial intelligence in Brazil. And I said, especially thinking about translation. I mean, artificial intelligence is reaching a great deal in translation. And then my question was, from everything you are learning how to make a good translation, did you come to some point that could enter the scientific what are being discussed about human language? Because that's what we really want to know. And his answer was very clear. We can say nothing about how the human mind works. Everything they do is to join words, the normal meaning of words, try to put some data, but creativity is completely out. Artificial intelligence can do only what is already known. Then you make statistics, you make a lot of data, but you are unable to really, you can make a lot on traffic, you can make a lot on things, but you cannot advance not even a little bit on how human beings really work. So I think it's fantastic, everything that's being discovered. It's fantastic to use such things, but it is a complete illusion to imagine that this is going to solve the real human problems. So I like the whole of it. I understand part of it. I'm a physicist. I know a lot of mathematics. But really, education is something else. Education for engineering and for computing is perfect, this line. Sorry.
Anyone wants to go forward? I have another point which I'd like to raise. You mentioned that we didn't change the way we think. And it came to my mind, what we face as teachers, the students, they think differently than we did. In a way that we used to be more receptive to staying in a classroom just like a bucket, as you said, and people throwing things on our bucket. That doesn't happen anymore. They don't have the patience for that. At the same time, they have skills that we didn't have, that we don't have. I don't have those skills in terms of like as if they were parallel processing many things, multiple attentions, and so on. And I don't have that as much as my son does. And he's 24, he's not. So probably the people, the children with 5, 6, now they are even more multi-attention people. So isn't something changing already because of the exposure to technology, to all this massive amount of information and connections and so on? I don't know.
Just I'm following you, okay? Yeah, as far as I understand, there is no multiple attention. And what we learned in psychology is that people change attention from one subject to another. And maybe with this technology, we are paying less attention to everything. So because every time we change from one to another, we'll have a gap to understanding and to understanding the new subject. So we think we are multi-attention, but as a matter of fact, we are changing attention every time, and sometimes this is the bad side of technology. I don't know if you agree with me.
I completely agree with you. I think you're absolutely right, and it's an example where our natural cognitive faculties are not sufficient for doing what we would like to do, which is to jump around all the time. And yes, it brings superficiality, and it brings an illusion of knowledge. And Google and Wikipedia, but mainly Google, is an example. The technology is actually very good in itself and can be very, very useful. But it does let us flick around, attending to this and attending to that. And in concrete terms, it allows us to cut and paste out of what we find in Google into our school essay or into anywhere we want. Now, we don't have to abuse this, but I think it can produce a certain quotational tendency where the ability to quote off cyberspace can feel like knowledge, and we parrot it. An obvious example is in school essays, because it's a problem for school teachers to tell whether the writer has actually written the stuff themselves. Now, sometimes we can tell because the style changes suddenly. But I think there we have to say that the internet can be a blessing and a curse. But it is on the theme you mentioned, which is fragmented attention. And there, well, I can show you the slide if you like, but I would mention the Greek Stoics from the Hellenistic period of Greek philosophy. Now, they were not talking about the internet, obviously, but they were talking about the temptation to be drawn to this and drawn to that and drawn to the next thing. And they advise something they call disinterest, which sounds a bit negative. But the positive version is just the capacity to keep our minds on one thing steadily, and then deliberately to change to something else. So I'm not the only one who thinks that there is a space nowadays for a new Stoicism. Would you like to reply? No?
Okay, I would like to comment a little. For sure, we are changing a lot in the sense of being able of seeing a lot of things at the same time and superficially around everything. But what I see, it's one possibility, because that's the direction of the behavior of all animals. What animals can do, it's absolutely fantastic. We are unable to do what animals do. I mean, they react because they have already an amount of memory and what goes well when, and so it becomes more or less automatic pilot. And we know this. When we start to do something with a routine, you do everything quite efficiently without thinking about it any longer.
So what's your point about life in the cognitive era? What is your point about life in the cognitive era?
Yeah, my point is that it seems, because you have asked what is changing, and I say that perhaps we are changing in the direction of becoming more effective animals. Perhaps all that humankind has developed previously was due to a very specific difficulty related to socialization. That's a theory about that. Why did we develop all these reasonings and all these crazy things? Because it was about impossible to interact between us. Now, the moment when these things start to become very easy, as it seems to be nowadays, it seems that everybody is very happy with everything. Then it seems that you can stay in this level and you don't need all that humanity has considered previously the most important. At least that's the conclusion I'm arriving after seeing the difference between the generations before me and the generations after me. It's a complete change of values in the direction of what should you focus. What should you focus and what you should quickly give up. So I think we are becoming effective animals, more than we were before. But unfortunately, this means to die everything I believed previously. That's it.
Yeah. So nice talk. Thank you for your talk.
Thank you.
I think that there are two issues that have changed our way of living with this cognitive area. One is our relation to time. It seems that everything that lasts more than 5 seconds is bad in advance. So I think that the rigor we have in constructing knowledge or building things, it's different. And associated with that is that our use of our memory, we have put our memory outside. And I don't know what will be the impact of this in the long term, but I guess another day I figure out that I didn't know the phone number of my mother. And she said, "You don't know my number?" I said, no, it's already in the phone, so I don't need. So this word, I don't need, means something. that we are giving power to some external entity to give us. So I'd like you to comment on these two issues.
That we're giving power to external entities. Yeah. This is certainly a deep point, and one which science fiction writers and filmmakers have attended to. So in 2001, A Space Odyssey, the computer HAL runs the spaceship. So we have given power to the machine, and then it all goes wrong, and it tries to take over. Is it that sort of thing you mean, or is it more a matter of transfer of cognitive load over onto pocket calculators and phone books and mobile phones and so on?
So if one day you don't have connection, you are lost. You cannot phone somebody, or you cannot have the information to do something. So I think this is rather bad. In my opinion, it's rather bad.
No, your example is certainly right. If somebody pulls the plug out, we don't know what to do. I mean, this is true. When pocket calculators came in, people said that school children would be disadvantaged as well as advantaged. That's just an example. In fact, people said it when the slide rule was introduced. I think it's hard to give a unitary answer, actually, because that sort of dependence is sometimes quite deliberate. We decide to use our energies for other things rather than memorization. And I don't know about Brazil, but certainly in Scotland, it was normal for school children to memorize huge amounts of text, enormous amounts. Now, most people say, thank goodness we don't have to do that anymore. I suppose we are dependent on libraries, and if the library is blown up by a bomb or something, then we are more disadvantaged. But I find it hard to give a right-wrong response.
I would like to make a point on what the professor said. I think it makes sense if we consider the Kate Stanovich taxonomy, then popularized by Daniel Kahneman, of System 1 and System 2. If we are together with machine dealing with machines, maybe we can go to automatic more to automatic decisions than to using the prefrontal cortex to make decisions. Then I could agree that we are becoming more animals. We could become more animals if we start dealing with machines only using automatic procedures. What do you think about it?
I don't quite follow yet. You're speaking about the prefrontal cortex? And
yeah, I'm speaking about what Daniel Kahneman said, that it's not from him, it's from Kate Stanovich, that mind operates with two systems, not even localized, the systems. The system 1, there is automatic systems, and the system 2, there is our high cognitive system that we think about, we deliberate, and we make a decision. Of course, the system would be more possible to be located in the prefrontal cortex. Yeah, it's just a question that if we are dealing and making everything automatic, we are not thinking about thinking a lot about it.
Oh, I see. I think in the examples I've introduced so far, it's a socio-technical phenomenon. It's not something the machines do all on their own. But of course, we can be more or less wise in the way that we interact with them. There's too much news every day in the world for us to filter and evaluate. So we've all been depending on newspaper journalists for a long time to be a sort of filter, picking out things that they think we need to know about. Clearly, we're coming to an age of machine-generated, personalized newspapers. I mean, it's obvious that this will happen. The agent learns about you and about me and what we're interested in, and maybe it's football, maybe it's something very different, and filters the news for us. Now, there's an inherent danger in that, clearly, because somebody could be manipulating the agent. And it's the same with the semantic web, which was expected to be a successor to the World Wide Web, but this has not really happened yet. But it contains enough interpretative power that it's standing between us and reality. And if it is manipulable by big business or whatever, then we stand to have systematic misinterpretation directed to us. And I mean, one little example of this is that you can pay Google to make your site rise up in the ranking. And you can also manipulate the metadata yourself to achieve the same purpose. But the easy thing is just to pay them for the public attention. So that's a fairly small example, but yes, if I've understood you right, then there is a mediating function being played by artificial intelligence of those sorts. And where that's happening, if there's an agenda, if there's manipulation, covertly behind the technology's role, then of course we are being manipulated. But I hope that answers your question. It does. Okay, great.
Yeah.
Professor, have you seen the documentary Humans Need Not to Apply? It's about the replace of the robots replace human in the work. How about the function of the robots in the life in cognitive area, replacing the human in the work? How about the benefit, the wellness? If the work has a social function, if the robots replace human, how about us? And how about wellness? Thank you.
I think it's an excellent point. I think we're in real danger from what you say, and the only thing we can do is prepare ahead of time. Now, in later slides, in today's slide set, I refer to meta-robotics. Now, by meta-robotics, I mean employment of humans to do a whole range of things which will be needed. So this is redefinition of people's jobs. So the robots, given meta-robotics, may change the world, they may change our life, but we have to beware of the employment issue. So by meta-robotics, I mean designing robots, repairing robots, integrating robots into a factory, integrating domestic robots into a particular care home where old people are looked after by the robots, etc., etc., etc. Teaching, training, short courses. But these are all rather white-collar jobs, aren't they? And so the blue-collar job, as we say, that's done by the person who picks potatoes out of the ground, is more likely to find himself or herself unemployed than more white-collar people. And so there may be unfairness. I mean, clearly, if everything were fair, then if new robots came along that reduced the work of humanity by 5% without costing us much money, then we could all have a few minutes more holiday. That's what we'd like to happen. But what looks more likely is that the effect is uneven and selective and unfair. And it's certainly likely to happen in China. We all know how big China is and how many people work in factories with their hands. Now, a lot of these jobs are already replaceable by machinery or robots of one sort or another. Take the case of a secretary or a receptionist who answers the telephone. Already software robots are doing that job, and they don't have to say that they're a robot. There isn't a law saying that they have to say, hello, this is the Royal Bank of Scotland, I'm a robot, and I'm going to pass your call to another robot. But in fact, they are robots. I don't want to say I've got simple answers, but I do think that the more we understand about a technology as a population, the better. We don't want all the decisions being made in the dark, So we're all very surprised to see what comes out of Japan. Humanoid robots that look and sound a bit like a person and may do all sorts of jobs. And robots that look after old people, for example, robots that speak several languages. You'll have seen the one called Now. It's only about this. I thought it was this big, but it's actually just this big. Of course, it depends what the big computer in the background is doing. The technology is not all in the Now entity. But I think we should, this is not me saying that education is always wrong and everything is wrong and mistaken. I'm not saying that at all. I'm saying that there are curriculum topics which the near future is like speaking backwards to us and saying, please give us these, at least. But I mean, do you have thoughts on how to prevent the possible unemployment? Okay. Okay.
Let me just add something. This is not new, right? This has been happening to mankind since the beginning. When the first man or woman invented a tool, then that person was able to do what two people would be doing. And then with the plow, and then with the machines in agriculture, and then so the history of mankind is the history of replacing our workforce by machine, by technology. And since then, what happened was what you said. So the extra time that we should have been gaining, and the extra power and the extra wealth has not been divided homogeneously, but few people were earning the benefits for that. So what's happening now is no different from what has been happening thousands of years. I don't know. Just the problem is that now the scale is unprecedented because of the type of technology. And again, what we see is that the money and the benefit that comes from this new technology goes to maybe 5, 6 people, the owners of Google, Facebook, and you can count, I don't know.
And I would just mention the Luddites, who were workers in woolen mills, but machines were being introduced which would take their jobs. And so they started smashing the machines physically. And I agree with what Professor Saraiva says, that it's not new at all, actually. The case that frightens me the most, because I lived in China, is the case of manual workers being replaced, and this will happen. There is a big AI park being built northeast of Beijing, and of course it could be a good thing for the country, but no doubt one thing they will do is develop industrial robotics, which can threaten a lot of people's jobs.
Another quick point referring to automation. And as we think more automatically, well, you can do more things, and I don't know if we're getting more animals or not, but that also happens to us along our development. You start to learn to ride a bicycle. You have to think a lot on how to equilibrate and so on. But then once you learn, that part of the brain gets out of your way and just can use the brain to think where I want to go, what am I seeing. So I think the problem is that currently, although it seems to be people are swapping more quickly into different attention points, that wouldn't be a problem if we would use that extra time of our brain, or if we use machines like Google, etc. We don't need to think about some things because the machines are thinking. If we use our brain to think higher level things.
I mean, how is the situation with agricultural automation in Brazil at the moment?
It's increasing a lot. Yeah, lagging behind a little bit the other countries. But yes, you see many more automated machines, more data collecting devices, more systems and AI being used to support decisions. Yeah. What? Yeah. It's increasing.
It's changing the topic. I'm sorry if the question sounds a bit naive. I'm not acquainted to the discussion very much. But why is it called cognitive era? Because we relate cognitively to the word since always, and also binary computational is also regarded as a kind of cognition. So what does this era have differently? But it can be regarded, and when it came up, it was a kind of mimicking what they thought to be human cognitive. So it is a bit, you can regard as cognitive. But I don't think it is, okay? And another question is, movies like Blade Runner and recent TV series like Westworld, the thing with them is they try to make robots that mimic humans the most. So much that you can't differentiate them from a human being unless you make a special test or something like that. And there is always this ethical question, like, when do we start treating these machines as living beings? And in this cognitive era, it seems that that is not this almost psychotic tendency to make robots that look like us. It seems that we want to make things that we don't do. They will do other things. So what do you think about this tendency, if there is a tendency of making robots that look like us, and are they not? And if this ethical question will be put to us, even if we don't make robots that look like us?
Sure. I mean, one example of a robot that looks like us is the little Now robot, and its brothers and sisters. It's made with legs and arms and so on. Another is the humanoid robots, which are coming out of Japan, which are quite scary, and they're deliberately designed to look like people and sound like people. And as you say, this is not necessary to their functions. I mean, they don't have to speak at all. They could just have a ticker tape that came out with printed words, and they could be square, like a box, instead of walking around, and they could have wheels instead of feet. I don't really know why there is this urge to make the robot look like a human. I mean, if you look at industrial robots in factories that make cars, they don't look like people at all. But I have some videos I can show another time. I mean, there has been a movement in modern dance recently where dancers dance with robots, or they pretend to be robots. And the German music group Kraftwerk, some time ago, play on this. You know, the individual performers try to look like robots, and, you know, they do this sort of thing. Now, quite what point is being made, I don't pretend to know, actually. Except that there's a certain fascination. We like to think we're completely different from machines, and then it turns out the machines seem to become a bit more like us. But, well, do you have an idea? Why do you think there is this fascination with robots that look like people? Yeah.
It is a bit, it's strange. I was thinking about this yesterday, actually, because I saw the movie again. And I think it's a bit of a traumatic manifestation of a trauma we have, because all the modern society was built on the idea that we are separated from nature somehow. Then to be human, you have something that nature and other animals doesn't have. So I think it's a kind of trauma of our society to be put in face of ourselves and to try to understand what is that we believe that makes us different from nature. And yeah, I think that's it.
A very interesting point. Yeah.
Just less scary than, you remember Lost in Space? When there was that robot, it looked a little bit like a human, a little bit. Is it? So, but maybe it's just because they look less scary for someone to buy, to have in the house and so on. I don't know, somewhat psychological acceptance of the machine. You know? Because people do not have to accept the industrial robots. They're just for another purpose, so it doesn't matter if they're square or round, or they don't need to look like humans. But imagine if you have something square and strange and ugly in your house going around. I think that's...
But it's interesting that even if they don't look like human, the ethical question is always put to us. Like there is a robot that cleans the house, and there is a child I knew that used it to feed it. And it was, it had pity of it. So somehow, if it looks that it has life, it looks like living, we used to have some feelings toward it, and the ethical question is always there.
I mean, just to give some examples of what you just said, the Now robot, and it has brothers and sisters in France and Japan and so on. But anyway, it has been used in the hospitality industry. And the point is that people like it. They think it's great fun to go to a hotel and the receptionist is actually a robot. And quite why it's so much fun, I don't know. There is also a robot chef somewhere who can make your dinner. And it's expected that there will be a market in these things, even though we don't really need them at all. So yes, there is a fascination. And the Now robot has acted as a reception clerk at an airport. And so you speak to the robot and give it things. But I can't pretend to know what the appeal is. But there is an appeal. There's something about having a robot clean your house, which is somehow amusing.
What about the question of why is it called cognitive?
I mean, this has become common usage. Certainly IBM used the word, but other people use it as well. And I think the vague idea behind it is that you can put components together into a system and the result is greater than the sum of the parts. So with IBM Watson, there are 4 or 5 main components that they put together. And it could just be a marketing trick they're using, but this is the phrase people are using. I put up that chart and I call it CAR, C-A-R, because that's basically what it is. And I actually prefer to call it that. The word cognitive obviously implies something that humans and also animals are good at. But even in cognitive science, the word is not very well defined at all. It's supposed to mean something to do with action and perception. So, as opposed to feeling, perhaps. But I would be very happy if the word were replaced by something else. And that's why I say CAR, C-A-R, because it's, how would you say, a non-sentimental or a non-romanticized picture of something that we have. Yeah. But believe me, in cognitive science, that's why I brought this in, you see. I brought this in as a prop, because you can hang anything on a coat hanger. And what happened in cognitive science was it definitely brought people together in very interesting multidisciplinary ways. But to say that the word has an exact meaning, I think, is exaggerating. Yeah. Do you have a word you would prefer? Right. Yeah. But you want to call it techno-cognitive? Just came to your mind, yeah? Yeah. There isn't a word in common usage that I'm aware of as an alternative. Even the expression artificial intelligence is a bit unfortunate. Yeah. I still remember the first line of the first essay I wrote for Igor Alexander at Imperial College. And I said, it is not mandatory that artificial intelligence replicate the capacities of the human mind. And he was very pleased about this. But anyway, I agree with your skepticism, and if there were a better word, I'd be happy to use it. I think the vagueness of the word may in part reflect our state of knowledge, because we've not reached a final point, obviously.
Any other point? If not, I would thank you, Don, for your seminar, your thoughts, and suggest that we give a round of applause.